Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that'll make you grateful for LED bulbs and scented wax melts. We're diving into the absolutely nauseating, surprisingly dangerous and socially ostracised life of the medieval candlemaker. The person who kept the lights on, literally, while everyone else kept their distance. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You weren't born clutching a wick and dreaming of rendered fat. Like most medieval children, you entered the world in a cramped cottage that smelled like wet hay and disappointment. You were small, ordinary, a little too fascinated with fire for your mother's comfort. Nobody thought much of it until you started melting things that shouldn't be melted. While other kids played with wooden toys and pretended to be knights, you were the one watching candles burn, mesmerised by the way wax pooled and dripped. Not in a "this child is gifted" way, more in a "this child makes the neighbours nervous" way. By the time you were 8, you already knew how to scrape tallow from bones. Not for sport, just because it felt productive in a deeply unsettling sort of way. You weren't greedy, you were just observant, which in a medieval village meant you were probably going to end up in a trade nobody else wanted. You didn't come from wealth. Your father was likely a butcher or a tanner, someone used to dealing with the less pleasant parts of animals. Your mother might have sold simple goods at market or helped render fat for soap, which meant the smell of boiling animal parts was your childhood soundtrack. Then came the day someone suggested an opportunity. A guildmaster, or maybe the town chandler, looked at you, small, unflinching around dead things, and said, "The boy's not squeamish, is he?" That was the medieval version of a job offer. Soon after, you found yourself apprenticed, not to a blacksmith or a baker, but to a man whose workshop smelled like death had taken up residence and refused to leave. He didn't smile much. He didn't explain much either. Just pointed at vats of congealed fat and expected you to understand. You swept floors covered in greasy residue. You cleaned moulds that never truly got clean. You were told not to complain about the smell. You started having questions. Then you started learning not to ask them. At night, you slept in a corner of the workshop, not out of poverty, but because apprentices didn't get separate quarters. The smell clung to your hair, your clothes, your very soul. And sometimes you thought you heard the bubbling of the rendering pots even when they were cold and empty. And that's how it began. Not with a moment of ambition, just with a quiet child, a practical town, and a job that made everyone wrinkle their noses and walk faster past your door. You never officially chose the path. It just sort of happened to you. One day you were helping your father scrape hides or your mother stir soap. The next, you were standing at the edge of the chandlery district with a small bundle of belongings and instructions to apprentice with Master Willem. Master Willem wasn't your actual uncle. No one really knew if he had family. He lived just beyond the respectable part of town, close enough to be convenient, far enough that the wind could carry his workshop's perfume away from the wealthier neighbourhoods. His house was modest, but his workshop, that was something else entirely. The workshop was a long, low building with blackened walls and windows so grimy they barely let in light. Not that you needed to see much, your nose told you everything. The moment you stepped through the door, the smell hit you like a physical wall, rendered animal fat, smoke, old blood, sweat, and something vaguely sweet that made it all worse somehow. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was aggressive, an olfactory assault that made your eyes water and your stomach lurch. Master Willem noticed your reaction and grunted. "You'll get used to it," he said, which was partly true. You didn't get used to it so much as you lost the ability to smell anything else. Your first week was spent learning the basics, which meant doing the worst jobs. You hauled buckets of animal fat from the butcher's yard, the runoff from slaughtered cattle, sheep and pigs. The fat came in slippery, foul-smelling chunks, still streaked with blood and bits of membrane. Your job was to sort through it, removing the worst bits of tissue and bone fragments before it went into the rendering pot. The rendering pot was a massive iron cauldron set over an open fire pit in the back of the workshop. This was where the magic happened, if magic smelled like boiling death. The fat was melted down slowly, separating the usable tallow from the impurities. The process took hours, sometimes an entire day, and the smell... oh, the smell. Imagine every rancid, greasy odour you've ever encountered, multiply it by 10, and set it on fire. That was rendering day. Master Willem taught you how to skim the floating bits of tissue from the surface, how to know when the tallow was ready by its colour and consistency, and how to pour the liquid fat into moulds without burning yourself, which happened anyway. Your hands were covered in small scars within the first month, badges of honour you didn't want but earned nonetheless. You learned quickly that timing was everything. Leave the fat on the heat too long and it would scorch, ruining the batch and making an already unbearable smell somehow worse. Take it off too early and the tallow wouldn't set properly, leaving you with candles that bent and drooped like sad, greasy flowers. Once the tallow was rendered and strained, it was poured into clay or wooden moulds where wicks had been carefully suspended. These weren't the nice uniform candles you see today. They were lumpy, uneven, and ranged in colour from yellowish white to a disturbing brownish grey depending on what animal the fat came from and how clean you'd managed to get it. But tallow candles weren't the only type you made. For wealthier clients, there was beeswax, which was infinitely superior in every way. Beeswax candles burned cleaner, brighter, and smelled almost pleasant, like honey and flowers instead of, well, dead animals. But beeswax was expensive, controlled largely by monasteries who kept bees as part of their agricultural operations. You'd see it maybe once a month, and when you did, it felt like a gift from heaven. A brief respite from the tallow-soaked nightmare that was your daily life. Master Willem didn't talk much. He wasn't cruel, just practical. You'd work beside him for hours in silence, both of you focused on pouring, moulding, and cooling. If you made a mistake, he'd point it out once, maybe twice. After that, you were expected to figure it out or accept the consequences, which usually meant reheating an entire batch and starting over. In the evenings, when the work was finally done, Master Willem would sit by the small hearth in the main house, sipping weak ale and staring into the flames. You sat across from him, trying not to breathe too deeply, because even away from the workshop, you still smelled like you'd been wrestling rendered fat all day, which you had. Occasionally, he'd hand you a piece of bread or a bit of cheese, never much, just enough to keep you functional. And once, just once, he told you something, almost resembling wisdom. "People need light," he said, his voice rough from years of inhaling smoke and fumes. "They'll curse you for the smell, but they'll always come back. Remember that." You nodded, though you weren't sure if it was comforting or depressing. Probably both. By the end of the first month you knew how to tie a proper wick, judge tallow by touch, and scrub your hands with lye soap until they cracked and bled. You weren't being taught a trade, you were being taught endurance. Your first real test as an apprentice didn't come with fanfare. No ceremony, no passing of the torch, just Master Willem pointing at a row of empty moulds and saying, "Fill these by nightfall." It was a simple command, but it carried weight. This was your chance to prove you weren't just another boy who'd quit after a week of smelling like death's pantry. You started early, before the sun had fully risen, because rendering fat took time, and you'd learned that rushing meant ruining. The butcher delivered a fresh batch of trimmings the night before, great slippery heaps of it, and you hauled the buckets to the rendering area with arms that still ached from yesterday's work. The fire needed to be just right, not too hot or the fat would burn, not too cool or it would take all day. You fed kindling into the pit, watching the flames grow, feeling the heat begin to build. Then came the fat dumped into the cauldron with a wet, sickening plop. As it began to melt, the smell started, subtle at first, then overwhelming. You'd tied a cloth around your nose and mouth, which helped approximately not at all. Stirring was constant, monotonous, necessary. You used a long wooden paddle to keep the fat from sticking to the bottom and to skim off the bits of connective tissue and impurities that floated to the surface. These went into a separate bucket, which would later be discarded or, if you were particularly unfortunate, turned into even cheaper, lower quality tallow for the poorest customers. As the hours dragged on, your arms burned, your back ached, and your eyes stung from the smoke. Flies buzzed around the pot, drawn by the smell, and you had to constantly wave them away. A few always managed to dive into the bubbling fat, adding their tiny crispy bodies to the mix. You fished them out with a strainer, grimacing, and kept stirring. By midday, the tallow was ready. It had that clear, golden look Master Willem had taught you to recognise, and the impurities had risen to the top where you could skim them away. Carefully, using thick leather gloves and a small ladle, you poured the liquid fat into the waiting moulds, each one lined with a suspended wick made of twisted flax or hemp. Pouring was an art. Too fast and you'd splash hot tallow everywhere, including on yourself. Too slow and it would start to cool and solidify in the ladle, creating lumps and inconsistencies. You moved with deliberate care, filling each mould to just below the rim, making sure the wick stayed centred. Then came the waiting. Tallow took hours to fully set, and there was nothing you could do to speed it up. So you moved on to other tasks, cleaning the cauldron while it was still warm, which was easier than scrubbing cold, congealed fat later, organising wicks, checking older batches to see if they were ready to unmould. When you finally pulled the first candle from its mould that evening, holding it up to the fading light, you felt something almost like pride. It wasn't perfect. The surface was slightly pitted, and it had a faint yellowish tinge, but it was solid. It would burn, and you'd made it. Master Willem examined it, turned it over in his hands, and grunted. "It'll do. Make 50 more by week's end." Your pride evaporated. 50 more. You nodded, swallowed, and got back to work. This was your life now. Not glory, not wealth, just endless batches of candles and a smell that would never, ever leave. If you thought the smell was confined to the workshop, you were painfully mistaken. It followed you everywhere. It seeped into your hair, your skin, your clothes, and your very pores. You were a walking advertisement for the chandler's trade, and not in a good way. People could tell what you did for a living from 20 paces. Mothers pulled their children to the other side of the street when they saw you coming. Shopkeepers served you quickly, efficiently, and with barely concealed disgust, taking your coins between two fingers like they might catch something. At the tavern, you got a corner seat, far from everyone else, where your presence wouldn't ruin anyone's appetite, which it absolutely would. You tried washing. Oh, how you tried. Lye soap, rough as sandpaper, and almost as effective at removing your top layer of skin, was scrubbed vigorously every night. You'd stand in a wooden tub, pouring bucket after bucket of cold water over yourself, scrubbing until your skin was raw and your hands were cracked and bleeding. It didn't work. The smell wasn't just on you, it was in you. It had bonded with your very essence. You could scrub for an hour and still smell like rendered tallow the moment you dried off. Some nights you sat there, dripping wet and defeated, wondering if this was what hell smelled like, and if you'd somehow ended up there without dying first. Your clothes were even worse. Linen and wool absorbed the smell like a sponge, and no amount of washing could get it out. You owned exactly 2 tunics, and both smelled like a butcher's back room had exploded inside a candle shop. You rotated them weekly, boiling one while wearing the other, but it was futile. Fresh or not, you always smelled like work. Even your eating was affected. Food tasted wrong when you were constantly breathing in the scent of animal fat. Bread tasted greasy. Ale tasted like smoke, and anything with actual fat in it, well, that was just a reminder of your day job. You ate because you had to, not because you enjoyed it. Socially, you were a pariah. The other apprentices in town, the blacksmith boy, the baker's son, the carpenter's helpers, they'd nod politely but never invite you to anything. No dice games after work, no shared ale at the tavern, no casual friendships. You were fine to trade with, but not to be around. Even the local priest seemed uncomfortable during confession. He'd lean back slightly as if your sins came with a physical odour. Which, technically, they did. You once tried to explain that you were doing honest work, providing a necessary service, keeping the town lit after dark. He blessed you quickly, and suggested you pray for patience. And maybe bathe more often, he added gently, which was the medieval equivalent of bless your heart. Romance was completely off the table. You'd once caught the eye of a girl at market, a weaver's daughter with kind eyes and a lovely smile. She'd smiled back, started to approach, then caught a whiff of you and suddenly remembered she had urgent business elsewhere. You watched her go, and in that moment you understood your future. Solitary, smelly, and devoted entirely to candles. The other chandlers understood, of course. They lived the same life. When you passed Master Edmund's shop on the other side of town, you'd nod, and he'd nod back. No words needed. Just mutual acknowledgement that you were both trapped in the same aromatic nightmare. It was companionship of a sort, the kind built on shared suffering rather than genuine friendship. And yet, you persisted. Not because you loved the work, but because you'd invested too much to quit. Your hands bore the scars, your nose had surrendered, and somewhere deep down you'd accepted that this was who you were now. Not John the person, but John the candle maker. the boy who smelled like tallow and death. At night, lying on your straw mattress in the corner of the workshop, you'd stare at the dark ceiling and think about the irony. You spent your days making light for other people, but your own life felt remarkably dim. The workshop wasn't just your place of employment, it was your entire world. A low-ceilinged, smoke-stained building that had absorbed decades of rendered fat, spilled tallow, and general despair. The walls were originally stone, you think, but they'd been coated in so much grease and soot over the years that they'd taken on a blackish-brown sheen. Wiping them down only smeared the residue around. The main workspace was dominated by the rendering pit, a circular fire pit lined with stone where the massive iron cauldron sat like a bubbling throne of misery. The cauldron was older than you, older than Master Willem probably, and it bore the scars of constant use. Dents, burn marks, and a permanent brown crust that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Around the pit were arranged the work tables, rough wooden planks stained dark with fat and wax, where you'd pour, mould, and finish the candles. The tables were always slightly sticky, no matter how often you cleaned them. It was like the grease had become part of the wood grain itself, a permanent reminder of every candle that had ever passed through. Hanging from the rafters were bundles of wicks, pre-twisted lengths of flax or hemp ready to be dipped or suspended in moulds. They swayed gently whenever anyone walked past, creating strange shadows in the firelight. Next to them hung strips of dried membrane and gut, which could also be used for wicks in a pinch, though they smelled even worse when burning. The moulds themselves were stored on shelves along one wall, clay moulds for common tallow candles, wooden moulds for specialty sizes, and a few precious metal moulds for the rare beeswax candles. Each mould was slightly different, worn by use, and you'd learned their individual quirks. This one cooled unevenly. That one always stuck unless you greased it first. The tall, skinny one in the back had a crack that leaked if you poured too fast. In one corner stood barrels of rendered tallow, already prepared and waiting to be melted down for the next batch. They had lids, but the smell leaked out anyway, a constant low-level assault on your senses. Next to them were smaller containers of beeswax, carefully sealed and locked, because that stuff was worth its weight in silver. The tools of your trade were simple but essential. Long wooden stirring paddles scarred and darkened by fire, metal ladles for pouring, their handles wrapped in cloth to protect your hands from the heat, skimmers and strainers for removing impurities, knives for trimming wicks and cutting finished candles to size, and everywhere, rags. Greasy, smoke-stained rags used for everything from wiping hands to cleaning spills to smothering small fires when things got exciting. The floor was packed dirt, layered over the years with spilled tallow that had soaked in and hardened, creating an uneven, slightly squishy surface that made strange squelching sounds when you walked. No amount of sweeping helped. The grease was part of the floor now, a permanent installation. Ventilation was theoretical at best. There were gaps in the walls, sure, and a hole in the roof above the fire pit to let smoke escape, but mostly the fumes just hung there, thick and choking. On particularly bad days, when you were rendering large quantities or the wind was wrong, the whole workshop filled with a grey haze that made your eyes stream and your throat burn. Light came from the fire pit and, ironically, from candles. You worked surrounded by your own product, which would have been poetic if it wasn't so depressing. The workshop was never truly dark, but it was never truly bright either. Just a perpetual dim, smoky twilight that played hell with your vision. And then there was the bucket. No one talked about the bucket, positioned strategically near the door. It had no label, no designated purpose, but everyone knew what it was for. When the smell got too overwhelming and your stomach finally revolted, the bucket was there. You weren't the first apprentice to use it, and you wouldn't be the last. The workshop was hot in summer, the fire pit making an already sweltering space even worse. You'd work stripped to the waist, sweat mixing with tallow in a combination that somehow smelled even worse than tallow alone. In winter, the heat was welcome, but it didn't extend far from the fire. Your front would roast while your back froze, and you'd shuffle in a slow rotation like a rotisserie chicken trying to heat all sides equally. This was your domain. Not impressive, not glamorous, just functional. A place designed for one purpose, turning dead animal fat into light. And you, through some combination of fate and poor life choices, were its keeper. No one tells you this going in, But candle making requires precision. Not the fun kind with fancy measurements and elegant tools. No, this was the grim arithmetic of animal fat, wick diameter, and how long a candle could burn before it either gutted out or dripped molten tallow onto someone's best shoes. You learned, for example, that not all tallow was created equal. Beef tallow was harder, burned longer, and was preferred for church candles and wealthy households. Mutton tallow was softer, had a slightly worse smell, and was cheaper, making it perfect for common folk. Pork fat was emergency-only material, smoky, smelly, and prone to spitting sparks. But beggars couldn't be choosers, especially when the butcher's supplies ran low. The ratio of fat to wick was crucial. Too thick a wick and the candle would smoke and burn too fast, wasting valuable material. Too thin, and it wouldn't draw enough melted tallow up to sustain the flame, causing it to drown in its own wax pool. You learned to eyeball it, matching wick thickness to candle diameter, a skill that took months to develop and countless failures. Then there was the matter of additives. Pure tallow candles were fine, but they could be improved slightly with the right additions. A bit of beeswax mixed in would make them harder and cleaner burning, though that was expensive and reserved for special orders. Salt could be added to make the flame brighter, though too much, and it would spit and crackle. Some chandlers added animal brains to the mixture, claiming it made the tallow smoother, which was both true and deeply unsettling. You also learned the art of dipping, an alternative to moulding. Dipped candles were made by repeatedly dunking a wick into melted tallow, building up layers with each pass. It was time-consuming and required patience, which you had in abundance, mostly because you had no other options. Each dip added a thin layer, and you'd hang the wick to cool slightly before dipping again. After 20 or 30 dips, you'd have a serviceable candle, lumpy and imperfect, but functional. Temperature control was everything. Too hot and the tallow would slide right off the wick, leaving you with nothing. Too cool and it would clump and harden unevenly, creating a misshapen mess. The sweet spot was narrow, and you learned to judge it by the consistency of the melted tallow, the way it poured, the way it clung. Master Willem had taught you the basics, but experience taught you the subtleties. You learned that humidity affected cooling times, that the phase of the moon didn't actually matter despite what the old wives claimed, and that some batches were just cursed from the start, no matter how perfectly you did everything. You kept mental notes, a kind of oral encyclopedia of candle-making wisdom. This customer prefers thick candles that burn for hours. That one wants thin tapers for dinner parties and doesn't care if they drip. The church needs 4 dozen beeswax candles by Sunday, and they'll inspect every single one for imperfections. The tavern keeper buys cheap and in bulk, and won't notice if you cut the tallow with a bit of rendered kitchen scraps. Quality control was your responsibility, and it was surprisingly stressful. A candle that burned too fast cheated the customer. One that smoked too much could get you accused of selling inferior goods, and one that refused to stay lit could damage your reputation permanently. Word spread fast in a medieval town, and a bad batch could haunt you for months. You also had to be a diplomat. When a customer complained, and they always complained, you had to decide if they were right, if you genuinely messed up, or if they were just trying to get a discount. Master Willem had given you limited authority to offer replacements, but too many, and he'd dock your already meagre pay. The math extended to pricing too. You had to calculate costs, raw materials, firewood, your time, and compare them to what the market would bear. Charge too much and customers went to Edmund across town. Charge too little and you'd starve. It was a constant balancing act, made more complicated by the fact that you were competing with imported candles from other regions and, increasingly, with oil lamps that didn't smell like death. Over time, you developed a sixth sense. You could look at a batch of raw fat and estimate how many candles it would yield. You could touch a cooling tallow and know exactly how much longer it needed. You could smell, ironically, when something was wrong with a batch, when it had been overheated or contaminated. You weren't a scientist, you were a craftsman, with all the accumulated knowledge of countless chandlers who'd come before you, passed down through demonstration and grumbled corrections rather than written manuals. This was your education, earned in burns, failed batches, and the slow, stubborn mastery of turning garbage into light. In theory, you were part of the Chandlers Guild, a formal organisation meant to protect craftsmen, maintain quality standards, and ensure fair competition. In practice, The guild was a hierarchy of smelly men who met monthly to argue about wax prices and complain about imported candles. The guild had rules, lots of them. You couldn't sell candles below a certain weight. You couldn't claim tallow candles were beeswax, obviously, but people tried. You couldn't work on Sundays unless you had church candles to finish, in which case it was fine. You couldn't train more than 2 apprentices at once, which was rarely a problem because who wanted to do this? Guild meetings were held in a rented room above a tavern, which was convenient because everyone needed a drink afterward. The master chandlers sat in a rough circle, their apprentices and journeymen standing along the walls, trying to look attentive while secretly wondering how soon they could leave. The guild master, a portly man named Geoffrey who'd been making candles since before you were born, presided over these gatherings with an air of forced importance. He'd read out new regulations from the town council, arbitrate disputes between members, and occasionally fine someone for selling underweight candles or using questionable tallow. You attended because you had to, because Master Willem made you, and because skipping meetings could result in fines or even expulsion from the guild, which would effectively end your career. Not that your career was going particularly well, but still. The guild provided some benefits. It negotiated with the butchers for fair tallow prices. It lobbied the town council to restrict foreign chandlers from setting up shop, protecting local business. And it provided a network, thin and fragile, but there, of people who understood what you did and why it mattered. But the guild also enforced conformity. You couldn't innovate too much. You couldn't undercut prices dramatically. You couldn't offer novel products without guild approval. Everything was regulated, controlled, kept within carefully defined boundaries to prevent chaos and, more importantly, to prevent anyone from gaining too much of an advantage. There was a hierarchy, of course, master chandlers at the top, men who owned their own workshops and had completed their masterwork, a demonstration piece that proved their skill. Usually an elaborate beeswax candle, intricately carved or unusually large, something impressive enough to earn guild approval. Below them were journeymen, craftsmen who'd completed their apprenticeships, but hadn't yet made their masterwork or established their own shops. They worked for masters, earning wages and hoping to save enough to one day go independent. Some succeeded, most didn't. And at the bottom were apprentices like you, not yet full members, bound to your masters, learning and labouring in exchange for training and theoretically eventual guild membership. Your voice at meetings was non-existent, your opinions irrelevant. You were there to learn silence and endurance, in that order. The guild's emblem was a candle crossed with a bee, symbolising both tallow and beeswax work, and it hung on a wooden sign outside the meeting hall. You'd stare at it sometimes, wondering if you'd ever feel proud to be associated with it, or if it would always just be a reminder that you'd become exactly what you'd smelled like. Disputes were common. Edmund, the chandler from across town, was constantly at odds with someone, usually over customer poaching or price undercutting. Geoffrey would listen to both sides, stroke his beard thoughtfully, and render a judgment that satisfied no one. Fines would be levied, apologies demanded, and everyone would leave grumbling. There was also the matter of apprentice treatment. Officially, the guild had rules about overworking and abusing apprentices. Unofficially, everyone knew it happened and no one did anything about it unless it got egregious. You kept your mouth shut, did your work, and hoped you'd survive long enough to become a journeyman, at which point you could start the whole cycle over with your own apprentices. The guild was both protection and prison. It kept you employed but constrained. It provided structure but stifled creativity. And through it all, the smell remained, the great equalizer that bound all chandlers together in aromatic misery. Most days you were invisible, just another tradesman in a town full of them, hunched over your work, contributing to society without anyone noticing or caring. But occasionally you'd get special orders, commissions that reminded you that your work mattered even if you didn't. The church was your most reliable high-end customer. Beeswax candles for the altar, tall and pristine, which burned during Mass and filled the sanctuary with a relatively pleasant scent. The priest was particular, almost obsessively so, inspecting each candle for imperfections, measuring them with a marked stick to ensure uniformity, and rejecting anything that didn't meet his standards. These orders were stressful. Beeswax was expensive, mistakes costly, and the priest unforgiving. But they were also prestigious. Church candles were displayed publicly, seen by the entire congregation, and if yours were good, it reflected well on your shop. If they were bad, well, everyone knew who'd made them. Then there were the nobility. Occasionally someone from the manor would send a servant with an order for fine candles, usually beeswax, sometimes even coloured or scented with imported oils if they were feeling extravagant. These orders came with detailed specifications, down to the exact shade and size, and payment was generous but delayed, sometimes for months. You treated these orders like sacred duties, working late into the night to ensure perfection. The pressure was immense. The noble unsatisfied with your work could complain to the guild or, worse, to the town authorities, causing trouble you couldn't afford. Weddings were another source of special orders. Families saved up for beeswax candles to illuminate the ceremony, believing it brought good luck and showed proper respect. You'd deliver them carefully wrapped, accept payment and nervous thanks, and hope they burned beautifully, because if they didn't, the bride's mother would remember, and you'd never get another wedding order again. Funerals too required candles. Vigils lasted for hours, and families needed enough candles to burn through the night. These orders were sombre, delivered with quiet reverence, and you learned not to linger or speak too much. Death made people uncomfortable, and your presence, already unwelcome, was tolerated only because it was necessary. Occasionally you'd get strange requests. A merchant wanting candles carved with symbols for good fortune. A midwife needing long-burning tapers for difficult births. Once a travelling magician ordered black candles, which you had to make by adding soot to the tallow, and you didn't ask what he used them for because you genuinely didn't want to know. Each special order was a test, a chance to prove your skill and maybe, just maybe, earn a bit of respect. But they were also exhausting, adding pressure to an already demanding job, and when they were done, you'd return to the regular work. The endless batches of common tallow candles that kept the lights burning in cottages across town. Just when you thought you'd mastered the horror of tallow, they handed you beeswax, and for one glorious moment, you thought you'd ascended to a higher plane of existence. Beeswax wasn't rendered from dead animals. It came from bees, collected by beekeepers and monks who tended hives with the care most people reserve for children. It arrived in blocks or chunks, golden yellow and faintly fragrant, smelling of honey and flowers and everything good in the world. Melting it was almost pleasant, the scent filling the workshop and temporarily masking the underlying aroma of death that had soaked into every surface. Beeswax candles burned cleaner, brighter, and longer than tallow. They didn't smoke as much or drip as greasily. The flame was steady, almost elegant, and the light it cast was warm and clear. Nobles and churches preferred them, not just for their quality but for the status they conveyed. Only the wealthy could afford to burn light that didn't smell like a rendering pit. But beeswax was expensive, breathtakingly so. A single block could cost more than a week's worth of tallow, and it was carefully controlled, mostly by monasteries that monopolised beekeeping. You bought it sparingly, only when customers specifically ordered it, and you handled it with the reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Working with beeswax required a different skill set. It melted at a lower temperature than tallow, so you had to be more careful with the heat. Too hot, and it would lose its colour and some of its fragrance. It also didn't mould the same way, being firmer and more brittle when cool, which meant you had to adjust your technique. Dipping beeswax candles was a joy compared to tallow. Each layer adhered smoothly, building up a pristine surface that glowed in the firelight. Moulding was trickier because beeswax could crack if cooled too quickly, but the results were worth it. Smooth, beautiful candles that looked almost too good to burn. The best part was not smelling like death for a few hours. When you worked with beeswax, you could almost forget what you did for a living. The workshop smelled pleasant, your hands didn't feel greasy, and for a brief, shining moment, you felt like a real craftsman creating something genuinely beautiful. But it never lasted. Beeswax orders were rare, and once they were complete, you'd return to tallow, to the rendering pot and the smell and the grease. The contrast made it worse, honestly. Now you knew what it could be like, and that made the tallow work feel even more degrading. You dreamed sometimes of working exclusively with beeswax, of opening a shop that catered only to churches and nobles, where every day smelled like honey and your reputation was built on elegance rather than endurance. But dreams didn't pay for rent or food. Tallow did. So you melted the beeswax when you could, savoured those golden moments and then returned to the cauldron of animal fat, grateful at least for the memory of something better. For all their unpleasantness, candles were essential. In a world without electricity, without gas lamps or flashlights, candles were the only thing standing between civilization and total darkness after sunset. And that meant you, despite the smell and the social ostracism, were actually important. Not that anyone admitted it. Nobles needed candles for their manners, to light dining halls and bedchambers. Without them, they'd be eating in the dark and stumbling into furniture, which was hard to do regally. Merchants needed candles for their shops to conduct business after daylight faded. Taverns needed them to stay open into the night, serving ale and facilitating the poor decisions that kept the local economy humming. Churches relied on candles not just for practical lighting, but for religious symbolism. The eternal flame, the vigil lights, the altar candles during Mass, all were essential to worship and ceremony. A church without candles was like a tavern without ale, technically possible, but deeply wrong. Even common folk, peasants and labourers, needed candles. Not many, they couldn't afford many, but a few to extend their evenings, to allow mothers to mend clothes after the children slept, to let fathers repair tools without waiting for dawn. You provided all of it. Every candle burning in every window represented your work, your burned hands, your smoke-damaged lungs, your sacrificed social life. The town literally couldn't function without you, yet they still crossed the street to avoid your smell. There was a grim satisfaction in that. When you walked through town at dusk and saw candles flickering in windows, you'd think, that's mine, and that one too. You'd created that light to transform dead animal fat into something useful, something necessary. Master Willem once told you, late one night after too much ale, we're not respected, boy, but we're necessary, and necessity is more reliable than respect. At the time, you'd thought he was just drunk and bitter. Now you understood. Respect was conditional, fickle, easily withdrawn. But necessity endured. The town council knew it too. When they needed public works lit, night watch patrols supplied, or festival decorations illuminated, they came to the chandlers. They paid late and complained about prices, but they came, because they had no choice. You'd heard stories of towns where the chandlers went on strike, refusing to produce candles until their demands were met. It never lasted long. Within days, the town was desperate, stumbling through darkness, and the chandlers were welcomed back with better terms. Not respect, mind you, just acknowledgement of reality. Your work had power even if you didn't. Every noble who read by candlelight, every merchant who counted coins after dark, every priest who celebrated evening mass, they all depended on you. They might not admit it. They might hold their noses and hurry past your shop, but they needed you. And in the depths of the night, when you lay on your straw mattress smelling like rendered fat and existential despair, that knowledge was something. Not much, but something. You weren't glamorous, you weren't celebrated, but you kept the darkness at bay, one greasy candle at a time. There were no retirement parties for chandlers, no guild ceremony where they gave you a golden candle mould and thanked you for years of service. You simply worked until your body gave out or until you'd trained someone else to take your place. That's how it had always been. That's how it would always be. Master Willem never officially retired. One morning you arrived at the workshop and found him sitting by the cold fire pit staring at his hands. They were gnarled, scarred, trembling slightly. He looked at you, nodded once and said, "It's yours now." Then he stood, walked out, and you never saw him again. Just like that you were the master chandler, not through celebration or achievement, just through attrition. The workshop, the tools, the debts, the reputation, all yours now. Congratulations, you'd graduated from smelling like death to being solely responsible for an entire business that smelled like death. You hired an apprentice within a month, a scared-looking boy of 12 who reminded you uncomfortably of yourself years ago. You taught him the same way Willem had taught you, through demonstration and grunted corrections, through mistakes and scars, through the slow, miserable accumulation of knowledge that couldn't be written down, only endured. Watching him struggle with his first rendering, trying not to gag on the smell, you felt a strange mixture of sympathy and satisfaction. This was the cycle. You'd suffered, now he'd suffer, and someday he'd pass that suffering on to the next generation. It was tradition, smelly, brutal tradition. Your body began to fail in small ways. Your hands, once nimble, grew stiff and painful. Years of breathing smoke and fumes left you with a persistent cough that rattled in your chest like loose stones. Your back, bent over work tables and cauldrons for decades, refused to straighten fully. You were barely 40, but you felt ancient. The work continued. Orders came in, candles went out, money changed hands. The cycle never stopped because darkness never stopped, and people always needed light. You trained your apprentice well, perhaps too well, because he began to eye the workshop with the same calculating look you'd once turned on Master Willem. You understood. He was waiting for you to fail, to falter, to hand over the keys and walk away into whatever came after. Some nights you thought about it, about leaving, about finding a small cottage far from any town where the air was clean and no one knew what you'd done for a living, about dying somewhere that didn't smell like rendered animal fat. But you never did. The workshop was all you knew. The smell was part of you now, so deeply ingrained that you couldn't imagine existing without it. You'd become the thing you'd once feared becoming, a master chandler, respected by no one, needed by everyone and slowly suffocating under the weight of your own trade. Your legacy wouldn't be grand. No statues, no songs, no place in the history books. Just candles, thousands upon thousands of them, burning briefly and then gone, leaving only smoke and memory. Just like you'd leave, eventually. Another chandler consumed by the work, reduced to ashes and tallow-scented memories. And your apprentice would take over. The cycle would continue. Light would persist. And somewhere in the darkness, another boy would be told he had an opportunity, and he'd walk into a workshop that smelled like death, and he'd think to himself, what have I gotten myself into? The answer, as you now knew too well, was everything and nothing. Everything that mattered practically. Nothing that mattered socially. The medieval candle maker's curse, essential, eternal, and utterly thankless. Years later, when the workshops of medieval chandlers had crumbled and the guild halls had emptied, when electricity had made candles decorative rather than essential, historians would occasionally uncover the remains of old chandleries. They'd find the stained workbenches, the broken moulds, the layers of tallow-soaked earth, and they'd piece together what life had been like. They'd write papers describing the process, the materials, the social structure. They'd display artifacts in museums behind clean glass cases, romantic about the craftsmanship while conveniently ignoring the smell, the burns, the isolation. They'd never fully understand what it meant to be a medieval candle maker. How could they? They'd never stood over a rendering pot, eyes streaming, stomach churning, knowing you had 6 more hours of this ahead of you. They'd never walked through town and watched people physically recoil from your presence. They'd never chosen between eating and buying more tallow, because your last batch hadn't sold well. But they'd acknowledge, in their academic way, that candle makers were important, essential even. They'd note that without chandlers, medieval society couldn't have functioned, that these smelly, socially ostracised craftsmen were the literal light bringers, keeping darkness at bay one greasy candle at a time. And maybe, in some small way, that was the legacy. Not respect, never respect, but recognition that the work had mattered. That every candle that burned in every window represented someone's labour, someone's sacrifice, someone's stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. The medieval candle maker didn't get monuments or celebrations, but they got something perhaps more valuable: necessity. In a world that ran on light, they were indispensable. And even as the smell clung to them, even as society pushed them to the margins, even as their bodies broke down from years of brutal work, they kept going. Because someone had to make the candles, someone had to transform animal fat into light, someone had to stand over the rendering pot and endure the smell and the heat and the endless, thankless labour. That someone was you, surrounded by stench, scarred by burns, isolated by odour, but still, undeniably, keeping the world lit. And if that doesn't deserve respect, it at least deserves remembrance. So here's to the medieval candle makers, the wick dippers, and tallow renderers, the masters of smell and light, who suffered so that others could see. May their memory burn longer than their candles ever did.